Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to another show of this wonderful series that we've been doing with Dr. Jay Smith. Many of you know who he is. He's been at the Speaker's Corner for almost 25 years. He is a debater. He's an Islamic apologist and a polemist. And he represents also a amazing center called the Founder Center for Apologetics, and also he represents another interesting and amazing also ministry called I-Square, among many other things, of course. And we congratulate you, by the way, on your PhD. And we're excited that Dr. Jay Smith has been with us here in studio for a few days now, and we've been doing a lot of these series on the topics that are extremely problematic, extremely provocative, topics that I think a lot of people need to know about, but not just any people. Our Muslim friends need to be fully aware of them. And as a former Muslim myself, who grew up, born, raised in Saudi, and used to think one way about Islam and its history and its book and its man, I find it fascinating, of course, now that we are discussing new discoveries that contradicts a lot, if not all, of the traditional views within the Islamic scholarship. And that's what we're doing, myself and Dr. Jay Smith. Today, we are going to take another look and take basically a different angle in relationship to those traditional views. And we will start by talking about the traditional dating as it relates to the start of Islam, the rise of Islam, the history of the Prophet of Islam, and from there, we'll venture into a whole lot of interesting topics, I'm sure. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining me here.
Well, it's good to be here, and Al, exactly what you have been saying. Remember the earlier episodes, we said that Islam really is dependent on two pillars, you might say, that hold it up. And those pillars are one book modeled by one man. The Book of the Man, the Book of the Man. We've said this many times. We've been bringing it up in our own discussions. It all comes back to one book modeled by one man. And now the earlier episodes, I think we did about 9 of them, they were all zeroed in on the book, the Quran itself. Now we're moving to the man himself. We're now going into the next pillar. And we're looking from a historical standpoint, what does history tell us? And this is why it will be damaging. And we're warning Muslims right up front. This is not going to be easy to listen to. We do not apologize for this. This has already been done against our book and our man. For 150 years, we've had these same questions. Redacted criticism, source criticism, historical criticism, literary criticism, all these criticisms were created confronting the Bible and the person of Jesus Christ.
Correct.
And we've answered every one of those criticisms. That's why we understand this material better than probably anybody else, because we've had to work through it enough, especially the last 100 years. We've had to work through it. Now we're taking that edifice, all those criticisms, and bringing them over to Islam and asking the same questions that have been asked of our Bible, we asked of the Quran. We did that in the previous episodes. The same questions that were asked of Jesus Christ and how Christianity began, we are now moving to the person of Muhammad and Islam and Mecca and these areas. How did Islam really begin? And these are the questions we're going to do in these episodes. Now, to do that, we need to look and see what they say. And the Muslims are very clear that they have what they call the classical account.
That's correct.
Let's look at the screen, and you can see the dates that are there. So let's start with these dates. This is what you hear in every school, in every, I don't know of any other college or university in the world that has any other story but this story that we're going to show here. That the story is, the narrative is, Muhammad was born in 570.
Correct.
Okay? No one's ever doubted that. That he was born in a place called Mecca. No one's ever doubted that. That in 610 he was in a cave, and angel Jibril, as we know Gabriel in the Bible, came down, and as we said in the previous episode, said, Akra, read. And his response was, Ma Akra, I cannot read. Squeeze 3 times, and he goes back to Khadija, his wife, and she does a little test, have him sit on either knee, then disrobe and ask him, was this really an angel? And that proved that this was something authentic. And then she goes and has him talk to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, who is a Nestorian Christian. One of the ironies is a Nestorian Christian gives him and says, truly, you are a prophet. So it's a Nestorian Christian, according to the Islamic traditions, this narrative that really give Muhammad his authority. That was all in 610. So from 610 to roughly 622, there you can see on the slide, he then receives these Meccan revelations. And by that we mean the second half of the Quran.
That's right, and it's very distinguishable, of course, in style and format and everything else.
And how is it distinguishable?
I mean, it's known to be short, poetic rhymes. A lot of young Muslim kids, usually start there and by memorizing.
And most of the Meccan material we can accept. There's not too much that we would have a problem with.
That's right.
God is up here, man is down here.
Correct.
God does not enter time and space. There's nothing between God and man. So he needs these intermediaries called these Rasuls, these Nabis, and many of the stories there are about biblical characters. They're not the same stories you and I have, and they do not equate with the Bible as we talked yesterday.
That's correct.
But that Meccan material is the easy material. That's the acceptable material.
Correct.
Then he moves in 620, before that, in 621, as you can see in the narrative, he is woken up in the middle of the night, told to get on the back of a winged horse called the Burak, and he flies from Mecca up to Medina and then goes up to the seven heavens.
To Jerusalem, you mean?
Miraj, yeah. Sorry, did I say, I'm sorry, Jerusalem, and that's where the Dome of the Rock supposedly is situated, where that happens, where he then goes up. We're going to come back to the Dome of the Rock, hugely significant later on in these episodes. But that's where called the Miraj. How do you pronounce it?
Yes, Mi'raj.
Mi'raj. So I'll let you do the pronunciation so I don't desecrate it and make a fool of myself. That happens in 621. And then the next year, he then goes from Mecca up to Medina, and that's called the Hijrah. That's the Exodus from Mecca to Medina. And that's the beginning of the Medinan revelations, the first half of the Quran. Rule of thumb, first half, because there is some Meccan material in the Medinan chapters. There is some Medina material in the Meccan chapter. But rule of thumb, those really, if you take the Quran and just split it in half, here's the Quran right here, and you just put your thumb, this part, which is the first half, would be Medina, this part would be Meccan. It goes backwards. So just turn the Quran upside down and you get the right sequence.
Yeah, and technically speaking, it's not organized really in such a manner, just to clarify for our audience.
So how is it organized?
It's organized by chapter size mainly.
Largest to smallest.
Exactly.
It's just that he was not very long-winded at the very beginning of his ministry. He became very long-winded at the end of his ministry. Right. I'm saying that tongue-in-cheek. Please don't take that literally. That's the sequence that we're assuming that this narrative is correct.
Correct.
We're going to destroy everything I've just said in a few hours, but let's continue on with that classical narrative. So if you look at the screen there, from 622 to 632, the last 10 years of his life, then the Medinan revelations are given. In 630, he then comes back down to Mecca and takes over without firing a shot. No war. He did it peacefully. And then in 632, suddenly he dies, which tends to happen with most of us. Can't choose when you're going to die. Some believe maybe he was poisoned. We don't know. But that's what the traditions say. Abu Bakr takes over for the next 2 years. He dies peacefully. Umar then takes over from him, and he goes from 634 to 644. The next 10 years, he is killed. Uthman then takes over from 644 to 656. He is killed. That's and right. It's, as we said in our previous episodes, that's when the Quran was finally written down. And then Ali, the adopted son of Muhammad, should have been the rightful heir according to the Shiites. He then rules for 5 years in 656 to 661, and then he is killed.
That's right.
That is the narrative. That's the only story I've ever heard. Is that the only story you grew up with?
That's the story you've heard. And of course, when you get into the Shia version of events, they will tell you Ali would have been the righteous caliph to start with because he's the cousin of Muhammad. He's almost like the brother of Muhammad. He's the father of Muhammad's only surviving, at least at that time, grandchildren and so on and so forth. But this is the traditional Sunni.
Now, explain what you've just said. Muhammad had no heirs, did he?
He did not.
He had 4 daughters.
And
he did have 2 sons.
And they supposedly died mysteriously.
They died when they were too young. They were still children. So he had no male heirs. What is one of the odd things, if he had 12 wives, why is it he could not produce 2 sons? I leave that for the Muslims to answer, but that's a question I've asked many Muslims. He's not much of a model as far as if you want to ask for his fidelity. Not fidelity, but it's certainly that's a whole other question. But certainly was able to produce 2 sons. That's ironic in and of itself. But what we do know is Ali was the one that, according to the Shiites, should have been the rightful heir
Correct.
because he was part of the family.
Correct.
Now, do you know any other story? Now, I'm not giving you everything. This is just the skeleton. Do you know any other story besides this?
I mean, this is pretty much what every Muslim needs to know about. Of course, you learn later that there was a biography about Muhammad, Sirat Rasulullah.
Okay, now before you get into that, let's just look at this graph again.
Yeah.
This everything you see in red, in that dotted red line, is what we're talking about. Those are the dates. With the birth of Muhammad 570 and the death 632. That's in that rectangular red dotted line.
Correct.
Now, let me ask you, we're talking about the 7th century. Certainly, that story, that narrative of Muhammad's life, what he did, how it happened, how Islam really began, how the Quran was finally tabulated, all that should have been written down by someone who was there, right?
That's right. At least you would expect someone who was fascinated by the whole thing would have wrote it down.
And there was no reason why they didn't know how to read and write at that time, correct?
We know of people like Ibn Mas'ud and Ubay who wrote down even Revelations.
Okay, it mentioned that they wrote it down. Now, was this story, that everything I've just told you, was it written in that red dotted area?
No, it was written later.
Oh, so let's look and see. Let's go up the slide again. This is not when it was written in the red area. It was written here. It was first written down by, the story of Muhammad's life was first written down by a man named Ibn Hisham. Hold on a minute.
Ibn Ishaq.
Okay, be careful. Ibn Ishaq is what is attributed. That's what Muslims claim.
Correct.
See, his name is there. Look, and you can see, we put it up there. Look at the date, 765, Ibn Ishaq. You notice I didn't put the red line around his name. Why haven't I done that?
Because his material, at least most of it, is lost.
Look, none of it exists. We don't have any documents today from Ibn Ishaq. The first documents we have are from Ibn Hisham. Look at the date, 833. Ibn Hisham takes what was given to him by his own teacher, who was a student of Ibn Ishaq.
That's right.
And throws out what he doesn't like, and only retains what he does like, and then writes it down in and so that is the first tabulated biography that is extant today.
And the interesting thing is he introduces also for the first time the genealogy of Muhammad in there.
Interestingly, and this is in 833.
That's correct.
Now, let's do your math. 632 is when Muhammad died. 833 is when Ibn Hisham died. How many years have we got
201 years.
200 years. It takes them 200 years to write down the first biography of Muhammad.
And one of the most basic requirements for a biography is eyewitness accounts.
Absolutely. Now, even more than that, most Muslims don't go to the CIRA. That's the biography. They go to the Hadith. So when was the first compilation extant that exists today of the Hadith of Muhammad?
240 years.
There it is right there on the graph. Let's look at the graph again. There it is. 870 is when Al-Bukhari dies. He's the first to tabulate it in one form. He was given 600,000 of these akhbars, and he whittles them down, throws out all of them except for about 7,400, basically, 397. That's 80, so 98% he throws out and only retains 2%. Throws out the vast majority, retains only 2%, and that's the 9 volumes that we have today.
Correct.
We're thinking that's the 9. It's attributed to him because even the earliest document we have for Al-Bukhari is not to the 11th century, and that's only 1 volume. You have to go to the 17th century to get all 9 together.
That's correct.
This is, you can see where there's an awful lot yet to do research on Al-Bukhari and whether or not he's even authoritative.
Exactly, because the fundamental question is, do we have even an original manuscript for Al-Bukhari?
No, we don't. Not until the 11th century, and he was there in the 9th century. So it takes another 200 years before we even get a manuscript that we can even attribute to him, and that's only 1 volume of 9. So there you're talking about 240 years after the Prophet. When you get to the tafsir and the tahriq, which would be the commentaries that explain the Quran, and the tahriq, which would be the history of all of mankind up until the time of Muhammad, they are introduced by a man named Al-Tabari. Look on the graph again. You'll see when he died, 923. So that's the 10th century. So everything we know about Muhammad, everything, you can see it on this graph there, everything we know about who Muhammad was, what he did, comes from Ibn Ishaq, 765. We don't have his material, so we have to go to Ibn Hisham, 833, Al-Bukhari, 870, Al-Tabari, 923, and later.
And I want to just make a comment right here. I'm going to ask my Muslim friends who are watching this, doesn't this prove to you that Islam is a man-made all the way? All the way.
Hundreds of years later.
Exactly. I mean, what else, what kind of evidence do you need to prove that it's 200 years later, you have information all of a sudden written about a man that lived 200 years earlier. Will you yourself write anything about somebody who lived 100 years earlier or 50 years earlier without a single eyewitness account and be able to publish it?
No, we're Christians. We go to Jesus Christ. Let's go up and look at the slide I want to put up next, because look at this slide. Here's a comparison. If we as Christians were dependent on who Jesus Christ was, what he did and what he said, and we know that immediately from the writings of Paul were written within 15 years of Christ's death. We know that the tafsir, let's do like with like. The CIRA of Jesus, which would be the biography of Jesus, would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Right? That's correct. That would be his life.
The equivalent to that, exactly.
That's the black letter of the Gospels.
That's correct.
The Hadith, what Jesus said, would be the red letters. In my Bible, we have red and black. What Jesus said is written in red. That would be the Hadith of Jesus.
Correct.
So we know that three of those, the CIRA and the Hadith of Jesus, were written within, at the latest, 40 years after Christ's death for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John would have been written within 60 years of Christ's death. And when you talk about equivalence, if you want to look at tafsir, that would be Paul's letters, would be the tafsir. They were written within 15 years of Christ's death. They begun to.
That's right.
If you want to talk about the Tariq, the history, that would be the book of Acts.
That's correct.
It would be the history of the early church.
And written probably within
between
also
52 and 62 AD by Luke. So there you have the CIRA, the Hadith, the tafsir, and the Tariq of Jesus, all written within 15 to 60 years of Christ's death. Look at the exact same genre for Islam about who Muhammad was, what he said, and about the history of the early Islam. That is 200 to 300 years difference. If we were dependent on who Jesus was, and we had the very same type of material that Islam has about Muhammad and the beginning of Islam, we would know nothing about Jesus until the 3rd century.
Correct.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would not have existed in the 1st century. We would be dependent on the 3rd century to even know who this man was, what he did. How would we defend him?
And you know, brother, here is what troubles me is that Muslims keep always going back to the fact that the one of the early, the P52 papyri, that it dates like 100 or to 110 AD. They're upset about that, and how can we even prove that any of the accounts are true? Yet it is still within the range versus the 300.
Basically, what we're saying is Islam has a real problem here. Everything we know about who Muhammad was, how Islam began, what happened between him and his wives and his family, where even the name Mecca is nothing that exists in the 1st century. And we're going to get even better as we move into these episodes. We're going to now move into what the concern is of the historians. But you can see already, we're now doing like with like. And like with like, I'm so glad that we as Christians have authoritative eyewitness account. Matthew and John were actually there. They were with Jesus for the last 3 years. They saw what he did. They heard what he said. They wrote verbatim what they knew about what he said and did. Thank God for the eyewitness accounts. Mark and Luke got it from the eyewitnesses. And that's why we can know exactly who Jesus was, what he said. If you want to talk about whether we have the originals or not, that's not even in question. Nobody doubts that Jesus existed. Nobody doubts that he died on the cross. We have Thallus, we have Phlegon, we have Tacitus, we have Josephus,
even
Greek,
non-Christian
Roman,
sources.
all of these non-Christians that support the death of Jesus Christ. We talked about that in an early episode. But when you look at what we have historically versus what Islam has historically, there's no comparison, but it gets much worse. We're going to show you now what we're now finding, because everything we know is from the 9th and 10th century. That's 200 to 300 years later. Wouldn't you like to go back to the 7th century?
Absolutely.
We're going to do that in the next episode.
And with that in mind, as you can see now, I'm speaking to my audience, why this is a very rich material that we do not want to do it disservice by just cramming it all up in one episode. So we're going to have multi-parts of this particular series. Thank you so much, Dr. J. And until we meet again in part 2, have a blessed day. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss future videos. And please consider becoming a patron on patreon.com/CIRA International.